The United States has just dropped a bombshell, accusing Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso of hoarding his nation's gold to shield his regime. The words came not from rumor, not from a journalist, but from a decorated American general testifying before the Senate. This was no accident. It was deliberate, calculated, and meant to echo far beyond Washington's walls. But here is the secret behind the curtain, the piece that has never been spoken aloud. Why would the most powerful nation on Earth, armed with trillion-dollar budgets and nuclear might, choose to focus its attention on one African country's gold vaults? What danger do they see in a young leader determined to refine his own resources and stand on his own? This is not just about accusations of corruption. It is about control versus independence, submission versus sovereignty. And for the first time in decades, the balance of that struggle may be shifting. If you believe this is more than news, if you believe it is the awakening of Africa itself, then subscribe and stay with us. Because the story of Ibrahim Traoré is not only Africa news, it is a revelation of hidden power plays the world was never meant to see. It all began in Washington, D.C., inside the chambers of the United States Senate Armed Services Committee. There, General Michael Langley, commander of United States Africa Command, delivered a public statement that sent shockwaves across continents. His words were clear. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso is misusing his country's gold reserves to shield his regime. He presented no documents, no named sources, and no hard evidence. Yet the power of such an accusation, coming from the mouth of a top general under oath, was more than enough to ignite headlines and plant doubt. Burkina Faso, however, was not silent. On the 21st of February in the year 2024, its government formally suspended all permits for the export of artisanal and semi-mechanized gold production. The move was designed to reorganize and clean up a sector that for decades had enriched foreign companies while leaving the population in poverty. Gold is the nation's single largest export, accounting for 37% of total exports in the year 2020. More than 1 million citizens earn their living through artisanal mining, making the industry both an economic lifeline and a national vulnerability. The numbers tell an even deeper story. Industrial gold production in Burkina Faso fell from 66.8 tons in the year 2021 to 57.6 tons in the year 2022. That is a decline of 13.7% in a single year. Facing this downturn, the government did not bow to the International Monetary Fund or foreign lenders. Instead, it launched construction of the nation's first domestic gold refinery, with an annual refining capacity of 150 tons of gold at a purity of 99.99%. For a country long forced to export raw material to Europe or Asia, this was nothing less than a declaration of economic sovereignty. And so, the real question emerges. Why would the United States, a nation with trillion-dollar budgets and unmatched global power, choose to shine its spotlight on the gold vaults of one of the world's poorest countries? Why did this warning come not from the Treasury or the State Department, but from the highest ranks of its military command? The answer is beginning to reveal itself. This was never only about money. It was about control, about obedience, and about the rising possibility of independence in Africa. The accusation from Washington was supposed to put Captain Ibrahim Traoré on the defensive. It did the opposite. Within hours of General Langley's testimony echoing across international media, the government of Burkina Faso issued a formal statement. There was no apology, no frantic denial, and no attempt to soften its words. Instead, the message was calm, firm, and precise. Every ounce of gold extracted inside the country was accounted for, audited, and managed through state structures under the national budget. In plain terms, Ouagadougou declared, "We do not answer to you." That was the true shock. Washington had expected panic, confusion, or at least hesitation. What it received instead was composure, delivered with the certainty of a nation that had spent the last year rewriting its own destiny. The response ignited a wave of confidence inside Burkina Faso. Posters bearing Traoré's image with the words, "For the people, by the people," appeared across markets, city walls, and dusty rural streets. To the ordinary citizen, this was not merely a rebuttal of a foreign general's accusation. It was proof that their government was speaking for them, not for Paris, Washington, or the International Monetary Fund. For decades, Burkina Faso citizens had watched profits from their mines flow outward. French boardrooms and foreign shareholders had always received the lion's share, while local communities were left with polluted rivers and fragile jobs. Now, with Traoré's policies, there was a visible shift. Contracts were being re-examined. Offshore profits were being challenged. Cooperatives and local miners were being prioritized. For the first time in living memory, people felt that their nation's gold might truly belong to them. This surge of national pride was not fueled by fiery speeches alone. It was visible in the reforms themselves, shutting out the International Monetary Fund, refusing foreign loans with hidden strings, and investing directly in domestic refining capacity. Ordinary men and women could sense that something historic was unfolding. But there was also an unspoken recognition. Standing up to the West has never been without consequences. History had shown them that leaders like Thomas Sankara were silenced when they went too far. And yet, instead of fear, the streets of Burkina Faso pulsed with a new determination. To many, the accusation from Washington only confirmed what they already believed, that Traoré was challenging a system powerful nations were desperate to preserve. The reason this story carries the weight of a headline like Captain Traoré becomes America's most wanted over Burkina's gold deal lies in the timing and the symbolism of his decisions. The suspension of raw gold exports and the announcement of domestic refining was not a minor policy change. It was a direct strike at the global economic order that depends on African resources flowing outward, cheaply and quietly, to fuel industries in Europe, North America, and Asia. When Burkina Faso declared it would not only refine gold at home but also consider using its reserves to back a national currency, the move sent tremors far beyond Ouagadougou. For Washington and its allies, this was more than a financial experiment. It was rebellion. A country long dismissed as unstable, poor, and dependent was suddenly signaling that it could finance itself without Western loans or International Monetary Fund supervision. That is why the message did not come from a Treasury official or a diplomat. It came from the Pentagon's African Command. General Langley's words were a warning shot, reminding Traoré that resource nationalism has always been treated as a red line. In the eyes of American policymakers, gold is not just a mineral, it is leverage, liquidity, and geopolitical power. To lose control of it in the Sahel means to watch other African states, Mali, Niger, Guinea, follow the same path. International think tanks quickly amplified the accusation of corruption, suggesting that Burkina Faso's gold could be traded not for development, but for weapons or political protection from Russia and China. French officials, though quieter, were equally unsettled. Paris has relied for decades on African gold and uranium to sustain its industries and currency networks. Thus, the label "Most Wanted" does not mean Traoré is facing an arrest warrant tomorrow. It means that in Washington's eyes, he has become a dangerous precedent, an African leader young enough, bold enough, and popular enough to inspire imitation. If Burkina Faso succeeds in keeping its wealth at home, then why not Mali? Why not Niger? Why not an entire region that has already expelled French troops and begun courting new partners? And so, America's hostility reveals its true fear. It is not that Ibrahim Traoré is mismanaging Burkina Faso's gold. It is that he may be managing it too well for his people, not for theirs. Inside Burkina Faso, the gold controversy quickly transformed from an accusation into an unexpected catalyst for reform. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had already earned attention as Africa's youngest head of state when he seized power in September of the year 2022. But the American accusation over gold accelerated a domestic agenda that was already underway. Burkina Faso citizens had long grown weary of watching their wealth vanish abroad. For decades, mining contracts were signed in Paris or London, often with clauses that granted foreign companies the majority of profits while leaving local communities with little more than subsistence wages and environmental scars. The memory of polluted rivers, unsafe mines, and unfulfilled promises lingered in villages across the Sahel. Traoré's government began to change that narrative. Mining contracts that had been quietly awarded under previous administrations were now being reviewed line by line. Some agreements were canceled outright. Others were renegotiated to give the state a larger share of revenue. State audits were expanded, exposing profits that had been siphoned into offshore accounts. The message was simple. The wealth of Burkina Faso would no longer be a private treasure for the few or a pipeline to foreign capitals. Equally significant was the government's decision to prioritize local cooperatives. Small-scale miners, often marginalized or exploited by middlemen, suddenly found themselves with opportunities to sell directly into state systems at fairer prices. This empowered rural communities and injected badly needed resources back into local economies. In a nation where more than 1 million people rely on artisanal mining for survival, the shift was monumental. The refusal to accept loans from the International Monetary Fund also carried enormous civil meaning. In a country where debt had always seemed unavoidable, Traoré was declaring that progress could be financed from within. To ordinary Burkinabe citizens, it was more than economics. It was dignity. The sense that their nation's resources, gold, soil, and sweat, could finally be used for their own children's education, healthcare, and security, rather than for foreign debt repayments. The political energy inside Burkina Faso shifted. What could have been a moment of fear became one of unity. Street vendors, farmers, miners, and students began to repeat a common phrase: "This gold belongs to us." The accusation from Washington had inadvertently ignited a deeper nationalism, binding Traoré's legitimacy not only to his military leadership, but also to his stewardship of the nation's most precious resource. The domestic unity Traoré sparked in Burkina Faso came at a potential cost: real economic backlash from the United States and its markets. Shortly after the gold policy announcement, the U.S. Department of State elevated the travel advisory for Burkina Faso to level 4 do not travel, citing terrorism, crime, and kidnapping. While these security risks are not new, the timing raised eyebrows, suggesting economic implications beyond simple safety concerns. In global markets, such a sweeping travel warning often acts like a financial embargo. Just ask Peru, which saw a 19.4% decline in U.S. visitor arrivals following similar alerts. If that effect occurred in just one country, the impact of a do not travel advisory to a fragile economy like Burkina Faso would be even more dramatic. Foreign direct investment, already essential to Burkina Faso's GDP, could tumble as banks freeze lines of credit and insurers withdraw coverage. These delays or cancellations, though hard to quantify publicly, are enough to send warning signals across global investment networks. Burkina Faso's economy had rebounded by an estimated 8.5% in the year 2021, thanks in part to gold exports and services. A sudden pullback in investment flows risks wiping out hard-earned gains, especially since gold and cotton drive a large share of foreign direct investment in the country. Moreover, preliminary International Monetary Fund data for the first half of the year 2021-25 show that real gross domestic product growth was slowing to 4.4% year-on-year, while real output from gold mining declined by 3.3%. Inflation was on the rise too, reaching a 12-month average of 3.6% by late October, up from less than 1% the year before. These numbers matter. They demonstrate that what started as a geopolitical showdown quickly had the potential to degrade Burkina Faso's economic performance, and that erosion could ripple back to U.S. interests. If investments falter, projects stall, and mining revenues dip further, the very ambition of national autonomy faces serious challenges. Ironically, an attempt to curb gold nationalism may end up deepening financial reliance, the very thing Traoré sought to escape. To understand why Washington has elevated Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso to the level of a political adversary, we must look beyond the surface of corruption claims. At stake is not merely gold, but the structure of global power itself. For the United States, Africa has long been more than a distant continent. It is a vast reservoir of strategic minerals, energy sources, and geopolitical influence. Burkina Faso may seem like a small, landlocked nation, but its gold carries global significance. The country is Africa's fourth largest producer of gold, delivering more than 57 tons of industrial output in the year 2022, despite insecurity and declining yields. When gold accounts for 37% of national exports and contributes directly to over 1 million livelihoods in artisanal mining, a change in policy reverberates far beyond Ouagadougou. The United States relies on a stable, predictable flow of resources from Africa to global markets. When a leader announces that raw gold will no longer leave the country, that future production will be refined domestically, and that reserves may back a sovereign currency, it threatens to disrupt not only the commodity market, but the financial system built around fiat money. The American economy is deeply linked to gold markets, even indirectly. In times of geopolitical uncertainty, investors pour billions into gold as a safe haven. In August of the year 2020, during the height of the pandemic, global gold prices surged to over $2,000 per ounce, the highest in history at the time. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger consider redirecting their gold away from export dependence, they signal to the world that supply chains may be constricted, potentially driving volatility in prices. For Washington, volatility in gold does not remain an African issue. It ripples into Wall Street, pension funds, and even the value of the United States dollar itself. That explains why the message came from General Langley of AFRICOM, not from a Treasury official. Gold in Burkina Faso is not being treated as a commodity, but as a form of ammunition. To the Pentagon, Traoré's policy looks less like economic reform and more like the construction of a fortress gold as a shield against external control, and gold as leverage to align with Russia or China. In a world where strategic alliances are shifting, Washington cannot ignore even a small nation's defiance if it sets a precedent. Thus, the attention on Burkina Faso is not disproportionate. It is rooted in fear. The fear that if one nation succeeds in keeping its wealth at home, others will follow. And the system that has governed Africa's resources for centuries will begin to unravel. While Washington frames its accusations against Ibrahim Traoré as a matter of corruption, the broader world sees something different, a potential turning point in global power. When Burkina Faso suspended raw gold exports and announced construction of its first national refinery, it was not acting in isolation. It was sending a signal to allies and rivals alike. Russia quickly recognized the opportunity. In the last 3 years, Moscow has increased military cooperation with Sahel states, offering training and equipment where Western forces withdrew. In Burkina Faso, Russian advisors have been visible in security operations since the year 2023. But Russia's role is not limited to arms. By backing Traoré's defiance, Moscow strengthens its own image as a partner willing to challenge the West's grip. For Washington, this is more than symbolism. It is a potential axis of influence stretching across West Africa. China, too, is reshaping the playing field. Instead of lectures about democracy or fiscal transparency, Beijing offers infrastructure and trade deals. In the past decade, Chinese companies have financed roads, hydroelectric projects, and industrial zones throughout West Africa. If Burkina Faso channels its gold revenues into similar partnerships, the effect could be dramatic. Beijing has already become the largest trading partner for many African nations, surpassing the United States and Europe. In the year 2022, total China-Africa trade reached $282 billion, a historic high. Against that backdrop, Washington's warnings about Traoré sound less like impartial concerns and more like the voice of a threatened competitor. The domino effect is real. Mali has already voiced support for gold-backed financial independence. Niger, after expelling French troops in 2023, is exploring new ways to manage its uranium and gold resources. Guinea, rich in bauxite, has hinted at parallel reforms. If even 3 or 4 countries in the Sahel consolidate their resources and refine them locally, they could form a bloc strong enough to negotiate with global markets on new terms. That possibility is what transforms Traoré from a national leader into a continental symbol. The Most Wanted label is not about his personal fortune or military background. It is about what he represents. A young African leader bold enough to suggest that sovereignty means keeping wealth at home and refusing to kneel. For the West, this is dangerous not because it is reckless, but because it might succeed. It is no coincidence that many Burkinabés see in Captain Ibrahim Traoré a revival of a spirit from the past. a legacy that Western powers once thought extinguished. In the year 1987, Thomas Sankara, president of what was then Upper Volta, was assassinated just 4 years into a bold revolution. He dared challenge colonial structures. He nationalized land, abolished rural poll taxes, and insisted that our resources must serve our people, not foreign creditors. Under Sankara's leadership, rural peasants received land redistributed from feudal landlords. Wheat production soared from approximately 1,700 kilograms per hectare to 3,800 kilograms per hectare, enough to propel the nation toward food self-sufficiency. Sankara also launched sweeping social reforms. In just 4 years, the national literacy rate reportedly climbed from 13% to 73%. He spearheaded a mass vaccination drive that immunized 2.5 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. He planted over 10 million trees to combat desertification, constructed roads and railways without foreign aid, and redistributed land to empower citizens. Now, decades later, Traoré's gold-driven independence has sparked similar comparisons. Like Sankara, he refuses to bow to foreign pressures. But Traoré is building from the ground up. He is renegotiating mining contracts, nationalizing mines, and forging regional alliances with Mali, Niger, and Guinea. This divergence makes him harder to isolate or remove. To Western powers, this is the twist. What was intended as a destabilizing accusation has instead elevated Traoré into a continental symbol, a fresh opportunity for the democratic renewal that Sankara had begun, but was denied the chance to complete. Building on this historical echo, Traoré is crafting something even more formidable, a blueprint for a sovereign Africa, one shaped not by foreign tutelage but by self-determination. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso has already nationalized 2 of its largest industrial gold mines, Bangu and Ouagadougou, that were previously controlled by Endeavour mining marketing entities. In the calendar year 2020-24, state entities collected over 8 tons of gold, and in the first quarter of 2020-25 alone, they amassed more than 11 tons. Additionally, the government is establishing the country's first national gold reserve, a strategic step in asserting control over mineral wealth and redirecting profits back into public investment. These actions are not symbolic, they are economic empowerment in motion. By seizing control of its mining sector, Traoré ensures that gold revenues contribute directly to national budgets, infrastructure, and community welfare. By rejecting dependence on external actors, especially Western financial institutions, Burkina Faso is demonstrating that sovereignty can be financed from within. If this model succeeds, it offers a tangible alternative for other African states rich in resources but historically exploited. No longer must they export raw materials under inequitable terms. Instead, they can retain processing, value addition, and revenue charting an independent course. For the West, that potential is threatening. It is not anger that makes Traoré most wanted. It is the realization that this model could work and offer the continent a pathway beyond the legacy of extraction. If Burkina Faso thrives on its own terms, the narrative that Africa must be managed or rescued will unravel, and with it, centuries of structural control. What began as a dispute over gold has become a mirror reflecting the unfinished story of African sovereignty. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, like Thomas Sankara before him, is more than a head of state. He is a symbol of what it means to reclaim dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. The accusations from Washington may brand him as most wanted, but across Africa, he is increasingly seen as most needed. The numbers tell their own story. In less than 1 year, Burkina Faso's gold reserves jumped from 8 tons in 2024 to 11 tons in the first quarter of 2025. 2 nationalized mines now stand as proof that the wealth of a nation can remain in the hands of its people. These are not mere statistics. They are milestones marking the path toward a new economic model, one where sovereignty is measured not by debt repayments to foreign creditors, but by the ability of a nation to feed, educate, and protect its own citizens. History teaches us that those who dared to dream often paid the highest price. Yet history also shows that ideas outlive assassinations and sanctions. If Traoré's stand holds, he may not only rewrite the destiny of Burkina Faso, but also ignite a wave across Africa, a generation determined to be free, not in name alone, but in economy, in spirit, and in truth.